Well, we had an extraordinary week last week in the British Parliament, which many are calling the Week of Death. It started with the decriminalisation of abortion up to 9 months, and it ended with the legalisation of assisted suicide. And to discuss that today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Fleur Meston, who is a writer and campaigner. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Fleur.
Thank you. Last time I was here, we just had the second reading of the assisted suicide bill, so sadly it's still going.
Indeed, yes, the debate goes on, the campaign goes on, I think. So we'll get to that in a second. But of course, yes, the week started with this decriminalisation of abortion. And, actually, the vote in favour was overwhelming. But, tell me a bit about that amendment. It was even proposed just the week before. But so it's a bit of a surprise. What was your reaction to that?
I was absolutely appalled, but sadly not particularly surprised. To understand this, you have to go back a bit. So last year, there was the Criminal Justice Bill under the Conservative government, which had the same amendments proposed, although by Diana Johnson and Stella Creasy. But that bill fell because the general election was announced. If they'd gone through with that one at that point in time, it would have been defeated because of the Conservative majority, and Conservatives generally don't vote to expand abortion legislation. However, this time, the environment was absolutely perfect for it. Overwhelming Labour majority, massive amount of Lib Dems. They all prioritise autonomy and choice over everything. So when these amendments were tabled, so there were Stella Creasy's and Tonia Antoniazzi's, all of a sudden, hundreds of signatures on each amendment. So we could already get a sense that this was going to be quite popular. What's scary about it is I think the majority of MPs who voted for it didn't quite understand what they were voting for. I really hope that's the case, because decriminalising abortion is portrayed as removing women from the abortion law, so that vulnerable women who take very difficult decisions in extreme circumstances and abort late-term pregnancies don't face criminal consequences because they are vulnerable and victims. But what that fails to tell us is that it is ending the life of a potentially viable unborn baby up to and during birth. With Stella Creasy's, it also would have repealed the Infant Life Preservation Act, meaning that you can sort of look into the death of a newborn and investigate the bodies of dead babies, and also enshrine as a human right. Thankfully, that one didn't go through, but possibly because Tonia's was the moderate option, the choice in between, which was voted for with a huge majority, yeah.
But you say that, a huge majority in Parliament with this focus on autonomy, but out in the country, there's massive opposition to this.
Yeah, I don't understand this. 1% of the general public supports abortion up to birth. Whether it went through because MPs don't understand that that's what it is, which is really alarming. They should know what they're voting for. They should do their research. But with such a small amount of time to look at the amendment, that's quite difficult. So it sort of says that Parliament is completely out of touch with the general population. Either they don't know or they don't care, which both are really alarming for elected politicians.
It's not as if a woman couldn't get an abortion already. We did already have it up to 24 weeks, and that's more permissive than some countries.
Yeah, we have the most extreme abortion time limits in Europe, with the EU average being 12 weeks. We also do allow abortion up to birth for certain disabilities, such as Down syndrome and clubfoot and cleft palate, which can be fixed with really minor operations. So I think we already have a pretty extreme abortion laws here, especially with the 24 weeks, which was decided in the 90s because that was the fetal viability, which, thanks to medical advances, babies can survive now born at 22 weeks. There's already that 2-week gap, which just makes no sense, where in a hospital there could be doctors fighting to save the life of a baby born at 22 weeks in one room and ending the life of a baby of the same age in another. which Nigel Farage pointed out recently in a press conference, much to the media's dismay, because they do not want the abortion debate brought back into the country. They say this is settled, it's safe, legal and rare, which a lot of MPs say the same, but I would definitely dispute that. I don't think it's rare when 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in abortion, which is over 250,000 babies every year. Safe. You could say that it's never safe because one life ends in an abortion, but in 2020, Parliament brought in pills by post abortions because it was lockdown, people couldn't go to abortion clinics, and then they voted to make it permanent. Now, these are really dangerous. First of all, there's a much higher rate of complications for women taking abortion pills at home, and a lot end up in hospital having to have surgery to remove things that get stuck, infections, etc. Also, because women don't have to see a doctor to be able to get the pills, there are no checks on how far along she really is, how old she really is, whether anyone's coercing her into an abortion, whether the pills could damage her health because of her medical history, and all of these things. So that's why we've seen recent rise in prosecutions for women such as Carla Foster and Nicola Packer, who have taken abortion pills past 24 weeks and been investigated for it, but the courts have said no, it's not in the public interest to charge them. So then the MPs come in and say, well, these are vulnerable women, so why don't we just decriminalise it, remove them from the law, and everyone's happy, completely forgetting the child at the centre of it.
And forgetting the child, but of course there is also a deterrent effect. Is it worth perhaps having some of these cases where actually there is at least a possibility of, many of them actually aren't going to prison, but at least the possibility there to say, that this society does not think that this is something that should happen.
Yeah, it was absolutely there for a reason, this limit. Yes, to protect viable babies, but also to protect women who late-term abortions are dangerous. And with the decriminalisation of abortion at any gestation, that doesn't mean that women can now go into clinics after 24 weeks and have a doctor with them and perform a surgical abortion, which is what is recommended after 20 weeks. But they are only decriminalised if they do it at home on their own using pills. That is dangerous, and no one is safeguarding these women. It's extremely painful. If you search any forums like Reddit or Mumsnet and read "I took abortion pills at home," it sounds absolutely traumatic, and yeah, obviously very unsafe.
And where are we at with that abortion pills by post scheme? Because of course it was supposed to be limited to lockdown. What's happened now?
Well, they stopped it for a period and then brought it back for a vote. Should we make this permanent? Obviously, it's much cheaper to just send pills to women than pay for medical professionals to do it. It also means that they don't really have to accurately report complications, because you only report complications if they've happened in the clinical setting, or if someone goes to hospital and says, I took abortion pills and now this is happening. Some women don't say that. They will say, I'm having a miscarriage, to hide the fact that it's happened later, which is what happened with a couple of the cases I mentioned before. So also in the Crime and Policing Bill, Dr. Caroline Johnson tabled an amendment to reinstate in-person appointments, just a safeguard, so that women aren't having late-term abortions, so that they can be checked, that they're not being coerced, that they are as old as they say they are, and to check that it's safe for them to do so. But MPs voted that down. This is what's bizarre. They say that They have voted to decriminalise abortion to protect women, yet the amendment that would protect women, absolutely, they voted down.
I mean, the whole pills by post idea is almost disturbingly casual. You just get it sent out and you take it and you're on your own. And as you say, with very little medical care, I mean, would you say we shouldn't have that at all?
Absolutely. I think it's so dangerous. I think if we're in a country where women feel that they do need to have abortions, they should be done as safely as possible and not... what other medical procedures do you just get sent pills at home which cause you to expel something from your body, massive amounts of pain and possible for complications? You wouldn't do that for anything else. I don't know why this is something different.
Okay, so that was the start of last week, and of course that was quite a sudden amendment to be coming in a way. But of course you've been campaigning on the assisted suicide legislation, which has been in train since we last spoke, of course. And well, the third reading did pass in the end, but it was the margin did narrow, of course. Well, what did you make of the vote, I suppose, and then we can talk about the rest of it.
Obviously I was deeply disappointed. I do remember last time I came on, I said the majority was just 55. We only need to swing 28 MPs to change their minds. Now, as time's gone on, as MPs have properly scrutinised the legislation, we've seen committee stage and the first couple of days of report stage, so many did change their minds that the majority was reduced to 23. Also with many professional bodies, like the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who are neutral on the principle of assisted suicide, coming out saying, not this bill is not safe. It was encouraging. It shows that there are MPs who are willing to look at the detail, willing to stand up and say, hey, I was in favour of this, but now I've looked at it, I've changed my mind. I think what was most disappointing for me as someone that's campaigned against it, obviously all of the hard work and effort, but all of that work involved reading really scary stories and really sad situations that MPs have access to, but have chosen to ignore. Things like the amount of women in America who've had assisted suicide because of eating disorders, and that in Oregon, which is sort of cited as the gold standard that we were following until this statistic was brought to MP's attention, that 48% of people who went for an assisted suicide did so because they felt like a burden, which at the last day of report stage, an amendment was rejected saying that you would be ineligible if you felt like a burden. Because shockingly, some MPs, some who are even on the committee, believe that that's a valid reason. And if you feel like a burden, that's part of your autonomy and you should be able to escape that feeling by death. Crazy.
Were there any particular arguments? Obviously, you didn't sway enough quite, but did sway some people. Were there any particular arguments you made that you felt did actually hit home?
I think that one of the strongest arguments made was Wes Streeting's argument, because he is in favour of the principle. He voted for it in 2015, yet now as Health Secretary, he says we do not have NHS and social care up to a standard where people would have a real choice. And to have his expertise and his courage to say, look, I'm for this, but now is not the right time, obviously would hit home with a lot of Labour MPs who do genuinely want to protect vulnerable people. And perhaps the reason they voted for it the first time was because they don't want people to be suffering. But if we have 100,000 people a year who are dying without access to high quality palliative care, they are suffering, and we can ease their suffering. And we don't have to legislate for them to end their own lives in order to do that. They can live and have a good death if we will invest in it. I think another thing which started to hit home perhaps slightly too late was just how subjective prognoses are. I read a case study of a girl who had cancer, and she recovered and then went back for a scan, and they thought that they'd found another tumour, and they said, okay, that means this time it's terminal. She went for a second opinion. They found it just to be scar tissue. But she said if assisted suicide had been legal then, she would have gone for it. And she was only 21, and she would have missed out on the rest of her life. That's such a huge thing. That just should shut this down. But many MPs just choose to ignore things like this. Thankfully, yeah, a lot did change their minds, meaning that fewer than half of all the MPs did vote for it, because 314, yeah, that's less than half. So it does not have a parliamentary majority in support of this bill.
Right, and so in terms of that consultation process, I'm sure there's some criticisms to be made of it, in particular the composition of the scrutiny committee, as Dan Hitchens, in fact, made on this podcast recently. But nevertheless, there is still a big contrast. There was a 6-month public debate. People really got to air their opinions. As you said, these arguments were made. And I mean, there's a striking contrast with the just week that we had, essentially, for the abortion question. Yeah.
So when the public is polled on the question of do you support assisted dying, they are majority in favour. However, when you dig down and you explain exactly what it is, you find that a lot of people believe that assisted dying is the same thing as hospice care and palliative care, and support massively drops when you explain that. And also for this bill, although there was a YouGov poll recently which says that 73% of the public support this bill. Now, I would say 73% of the public have not read this bill. I don't even think that the majority of Parliament has read this bill thoroughly, line by line, every amended version. So to say that there is that public support for it is untrue. And I think that if people did read it, and if people saw which amendments were rejected at committee stage, such as your family wouldn't have to be informed. At committee stage, they rejected an amendment to mean that doctors couldn't discuss it with under 18s. There was one where if the lethal drugs fail, do you have a requirement to call an ambulance? Explicit protections for people with Down syndrome, learning disabilities, eating disorders, a requirement for pain to be in the bill, because right now you just have to have a terminal illness. You could be technically in no pain. I imagine that's rare, but pain and suffering are not requirements in this bill. I think if the public were aware of all of these things, there would be very little support for this bill.
Well, so we've often heard from, in particular, the proposer of the bill herself, Kim Leadbeater, that the whole process has shown Parliament at its best. Would you agree with that?
Not in the slightest. I think it's funny that she says that. In her second reading debate, she had to stand up at the end and apologise to the Commons for saying that there was judicial support for her bill. So it started off with a misleading statement. The committee stage was appalling when they called for oral evidence from witnesses. They originally didn't invite a single disability organisation. They didn't invite the Royal College of Psychiatrists, despite only a few weeks later removing the sort of foundational High Court judge safeguard who would give sign-off to people wishing to end their lives, and replace it with a panel with a psychiatrist on. Yet they didn't invite them for evidence. They invited witnesses from mainly Australia, but a bunch of countries which have legalised assisted suicide. Not one of them from overseas was opposed to it. The committee was stacked more than it should have been in favour of the bill. They just voted as a block every single amendment was voted down unless Kim Leadbeater did it. And having watched hours and hours of it, they just weren't really taking part. They were scrolling on their phones. Sarah Green, who is a Lib Dem MP, just didn't say a single word. Bambos Charalambos, the only time he would speak would be to move to end the proceedings for the day. They sat until around 2 a.m. one day, and Naz Shah had to go home because her hearing aids had run out of battery. It was just an absolute shambles. Then we had moving the dates around for when report stage and third reading would be. And in the final debates, they kept having to put limits on how long people could speak for because so many people wanted to speak. It just ended up so rushed that, like, they were literally speaking so quickly you could barely understand what they were saying. It was absolutely crazy. I've never seen anything like it. And as people say, yes, it has had many hours of debate, but it still hasn't had as many hours of debate as fox hunting.
Okay, and so in terms of what next steps then, of course, what's interesting about both of these is that neither is a manifesto commitment. And so that means that what happens in the Lords now is very significant. And in fact, it would be possible for them to vote it down.
Yeah, I think they're slightly different in terms of the abortion one has a pretty big majority support. And the assisted suicide bill had a very, very small majority. Obviously, neither were in manifestos, and with the assisted suicide one, as I said, less than half of MPs actually voted for it. What is good is they will both get more time and more scrutiny. With abortion, I think that Lords will just have to see how they can mitigate the damage, see how best they can protect women and unborn children. And thankfully they've got a lot of experts in there that will know their stuff on this and have been around a long time, and possibly since the last big change in legislation in 1967. With assisted suicide, yeah, they could, if they want to, repeal it. It had such a small majority, and just as time went on, the support was dropping, and more professional bodies were coming out opposed, even down to the night before third reading. An MP said, "I've changed my mind at the last minute," and some who hadn't even declared a change voted differently on the day. I think with more and more evidence coming out and more scrutiny and having to do all of the stages in the Lords, people should hopefully come to their senses and not do such a monumental, dangerous change in this country, at least at this moment in time. Okay,
and so more broadly then, I mean, these two issues are of course linked. You know, on the one side it's generally autonomy is what's spoken about, on the other side it's the sanctity of life, essentially. What do you think last week has shown about our country?
I don't think it's shown as much about our country as it has about our parliament. I think generally we are a much more pro-life country than our parliament on both ends of life. As like people recognise that 24 weeks is a pretty standard limit. It's fine. It's what we've accepted for like almost 60 years. But our elected representatives seem to be much more extreme. With concerning autonomy, that just does not address the fact that at both ends there can be coercion. Someone can be coerced into having an abortion, someone can be coerced into ending their life. But what I think this says is that our politicians are not listening to those concerns. They just have this sort of, I must always vote for autonomy and choice, no matter where that leads us, especially the Lib Dems, they're always saying this. And whether that leads us into really dark places or what is sadly up to them. I think this has come from the Conservatives sort of letting people down, meaning that everyone voted against them at the last election, meaning that we have a massively progressive parliament. Although I wouldn't say this is progress. I think progress would be enabling women to feel that they can continue with a pregnancy, and enabling people at the end of their lives to die comfortably. That would be progress. And all these votes seem to be doing is just putting a sticking plaster over huge social issues that we have in this country, which maybe they're too expensive, maybe it's too much effort. Instead, we'll just allow people to end lives as their choice. And
so finally, no parliament can bind its successor. Will these laws that have been passed in this hyper-progressive parliament simply be repealed in the next?
Let's hope so. And I would say that with how unpopular the Labour Party is now, hopefully we can get a government that values life more. I know that Reform have already suggested that they may put it in their manifesto to repeal both of these votes, which is interesting because Richard Tyson's Sarah Potchin voted for assisted suicide. And yeah, Nigel has been speaking out a little bit more on abortion, but sadly wasn't present for the vote on Tuesday. I don't know if Reform is going to win massive amounts of seats, that they would be able to enact this at the next election. But I do think if Labour continues as they are, and the public remains as angry as they are, which they really were last week, then there is definitely hope for repealing these laws.
Fleur Meston, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.